Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Word of the Day podcast, where useful words are pleasantly explained. I'm your host, Jamie Silva, and I'm joined here today in the RAV4 studios by yet another talented voice actor, Austin. Austin, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on the show, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So let's talk about today's word, which was sent to us by alert listener Joey. This is the noun comeuppance. In my mind, comeuppance means something like the due reward of one's probably bad deeds. And comeuppance appears in only two very similar phrases that I'm familiar with. First, receive one's comeuppance, and second, get one's comeuppance.
So if you're always littering, throwing trash and apple cores out of your car window every chance you get, and then one day you slip on a banana peel on the sidewalk and fall down, it might be said that you received your comeuppance. You got a fitting punishment that illustrates, sort of poetically, the error of your ways.
Right. Comeuppance has a real karmic sense to it, in that it suggests not merely that you were struck by misfortune, but also that you had it coming. Checking in with the online definition of comeuppance real quick, it goes like this, quote, a punishment or fate that someone deserves, unquote. Okay, yeah, so this doesn't so much include the poetic angle that my definition touched on, but I suppose that isn't crucial to the meaning. It's more of a nice to have.
The etymology of comeuppance really reinforces this idea of a deserved punishment, because it's derived from a court setting. See, the place where a judge sits to preside over a courtroom is traditionally called the bench.
Originally, that's literally what it was. It was an actual bench. And later on, even though judges had started sitting on chairs and whatnot, people had presumably just gotten used to saying the bench. This is why, when a president selects a new judge for the U.S. court system, they are said to be appointing that judge to the bench.
Similarly, during court proceedings, if a lawyer wants to tell the judge something in confidence without the jury hearing, they might ask for permission to approach the bench.
Here's where comeuppance comes in. See, back in the day, one way to describe someone getting hauled into court to face charges was to say that they had to come up before the bench, that is, before the judge, either to face prosecution or punishment. And a lot of times, the implication with comeuppance is that everyone in the courtroom, possibly even the defendant's lawyer, is like, yes, thank goodness, this person is so obviously guilty, I'm glad they're finally being held to account and forced to receive their comeuppance.
Although comeuppance is most often used outside of legal settings nowadays, it still conveys the idea that the person getting their comeuppance is definitely guilty, and the principles of truth, justice, and the American way all demand that they suffer a bit for what they've done, and maybe get a taste of their own medicine.
Ordinarily, of course, it's considered bad form to delight in someone else's suffering, a practice that the Germans refer to as Schadenfreude. But this is an exception. In a situation where someone deserves their comeuppance, I think most people would agree that a little Schadenfreude is acceptable, or at least understandable.
There's another little nuance with comeuppance where it's not just that the punishment fits the crime in the sense of being appropriately severe, but also that the punishment kind of mirrors, reverses, or links to it in some way, such that there's often a what goes around comes around connotation to it.
Yeah, so like if you steal your roommate's mango sorbet from the freezer and they make you apologize and pay them $5 so they can buy some more, that's sort of a comeuppance, I guess, but not a very precise one. However, if a few days later you discovered that you forgot to put your ice cream bars in the freezer when you brought them home from the store, and so they all melted and you couldn't eat them, that would be a more fitting reversal, and thus a better context in which to use the word comeuppance.
That's a really good example, because it highlights another interesting aspect of comeuppance, namely that we are seldom told who or what is behind it. Sometimes it could be a person, but it's more common to have the actor be undefined, to have it just be fate, happenstance, karmic justice, etc.
Yeah, like with the ice cream example. Your roommate didn't maliciously take your ice cream out of the freezer so it would melt. Rather, it just happened, through chance or whatever. And just by coincidence, it served you right. Or think about this. If someone says, kind of ominously, that it would be great if their friend Wayne got his comeuppance, they probably aren't hinting that they, plan to lie in wait and ambush Wayne with a paintball gun. But if, purely by chance, Wayne accidentally wandered into a paintball park and took a few bullets, that would be a fitting comeuppance, especially if Wayne's original crime was spilling his supply of oil paints all over your best throw rug.
Switching gears here, religions throughout history and around the world have included some concept of an afterlife, in which in many cases, punishments are dished out in proportion to people's bad deeds during their lifetime.
Now, we are painting with a very broad and oversimplified brush here, so please overlook any inaccuracies in this description. But basically, you could think of this model as kind of one of divine comeuppance, of people getting their due, for good or ill, but especially ill, based on how they lived. The ancient Greeks are perhaps the ones who went the furthest in taking this idea of divine comeuppance and really emphasizing the poetic angle, in which the post-death punishment must parallel the original offense in some fashion, lest the lesson be lost on anyone. One great example of what comeuppance looks like in Greek mythology is the story of Sisyphus. And as his story is told very well by the online encyclopedia of Greek mythology, we'll borrow heavily from them in the following account. Austin, go ahead and start us off.
Sisyphus was notorious as the most cunning man on earth, but his greatest triumph came at the end of his life, when Hades, the god of the underworld and the keeper of the land of the dead, came to claim him personally. Now Hades had brought with him a pair of shackles, or handcuffs, which were a comparative novelty at the time. Sisyphus, sensing an opportunity, expressed great interest in them, asking all about where they came from and how they worked, and eventually even persuaded Hades to try them on.
Notice, by the way, that Hades was the god of death, not the god of great choices. Anyway, thus it came about that Hades was kept locked up in a closet at Sisyphus's house, a peculiar circumstance that put the great chain of being seriously out of whack. Nobody could die, you see. A soldier might be chopped to bits in battle and still show up at camp for dinner. Finally, though, Hades was released, and Sisyphus was summarily ordered to report to the underworld for his eternal assignment.
But the wily one had another trick up his sleeve. Sisyphus simply told his wife not to bury him, and then complained to Persephone, the queen of the dead, that since he hadn't been accorded the proper funeral honors, he simply could not enter the realm of the dead.
Persephone kindly and somewhat gullibly agreed. So Sisyphus made his way back to the sunshine, where he promptly forgot all about funerals and lived on in great pomp and gaiety for another good stretch of time.
But even this paramount trickster could only postpone the inevitable. Eventually, he was hauled down to Hades, where he was condemned to an eternity of hard labor, and frustrating labor at that. He was forced to roll an enormous boulder with great exertion and toil up to the top of a hill.
But no sooner would he reach the summit than the darn thing would just roll back down again, every single time, forever. Because that is how eternity works.
Now, the reason this torment was related to Sisyphus' wrongdoing was that in the eyes of the gods, since he thought himself so clever and kept flouting their will, it was only proper that he be given a seemingly simple task that no amount of smarts, strategies, or shenanigans could help him complete. His comeuppance, in short, was fitting and poetic.
Now, you might say that it seems like the word comeuppance is being misapplied here, because being too smart for your own good isn't really like a crime or a wrongdoing in the usual sense. And remember, we defined comeuppance originally as being the due reward of one's bad deeds. This is a good point, but a lot of times you do hear comeuppance used to refer not to people who have done something bad per se, but rather just to people who are arrogant, too big for their britches, who think they're the bee's knees or the cat's pajamas, what have you, and need to be taken down a peg or two. Just as pride goeth before the fall, acting all high and mighty often goeth before getting your comeuppance. All right, it's now time to get a couple examples of how to use comeuppance in ordinary conversation or writing. Austin, go ahead and start us off.
Example number 1. In the eyes of certain vindictive members of the Homeowners Association, Brad received his comeuppance for his habitually unmown lawn when it was infested by a horde of burrowing moles and soon died entirely. Brad suspected foul play, but a grand jury refused to indict the moles.
Example number 2. "Oh, park in my parking spot again, why don't you?" muttered Jill angrily at the absent owner of the truck out front of her house. "I hope you get your comeuppance, and right quick. Maybe you'll get towed next time you go into the city. I have connections, you know. My cousin is a meter maid." Okay, now we're going to hit one more example here, an extended one that doesn't use the word comeuppance, but really showcases the concept. This comes from a short story by the great Russian author Leo Tolstoy entitled "How Much Land Does a Man Need?" The protagonist, a man identified only as Pahom, is this nice guy, an upstanding farmer living in 19th century Russia. Pahom is content, but definitely upwardly mobile, specifically in regard to land. "If I only had enough land," he said, "then I would be happy."
One day, he hears of this amazing deal on farmland that some far-off tribesmen are offering. Just one low price for as much land as you can walk around on foot in a single day.
Notice the catch there, though. If you don't finish walking all the way back to where you started by sundown, you lose your money and get no land at all. But Pahom decides to go for it. He makes the usual arrangement with the tribesmen and starts out walking at sunrise, eager to cover as much land as he possibly can before the sun goes down. And we'll let Tolstoy take it from there, abridged a bit to save time. Quote, "I will go on for another 3 miles before turning," thought Pahom. "The further one goes, the better the land seems." When he finally looked round, the hill he had started from was scarcely visible, and the people on it looked like little black ants.
He went on and on. The grass was high and it was very hot. Pahom began to grow tired. He looked at the sun and saw that it was noon. Still he went on, thinking, an hour to suffer, a lifetime to live.
At last, Pahom turned left and went a long way in this new direction also. He was about to turn to the left again when he perceived a damp hollow. It would be a pity to leave that out, he thought. Flax would do well there. So he went on past the hollow before turning the corner again.
Now it was getting late, and Pahom walked with difficulty. He longed to rest, but it was impossible if he was to get back before sunset. The sun waits for no man, and it was sinking lower and lower. He began running, threw away his coat, his boots, his flask, and his cap, and kept only the shovel, which he used as a support.
Pahom went on running. His soaking shirt and trousers stuck to him, and his mouth was parched. His breast was working like a blacksmith's bellows. His heart was beating like a hammer, and his legs were giving way as if they did not belong to him. He was seized with terror lest he should die of the strain. Though afraid of death, however, he could not stop. He gathered his last strength and ran on. The sun was close to the rim and cloaked in mist. It looked large and red as blood. Now, yes, now, it was about to set.
But the end was in sight. Pahom took a long breath and ran up the hill he had started from. It was still light when he reached the top. He had succeeded.
But then Pahom uttered a cry. His legs gave way beneath him, and he fell forward. Pahom's servant came running up and tried to raise him, but he saw that blood was coming from his mouth. Pahom was dead.
His servant picked up the shovel and dug a grave long enough for Pahom to lie in, and buried him in it. 6 feet from his head to his heels was all he needed.
Thus the story ends. And lest the lesson be lost, well, 2 lessons really, one about life and one about the meaning of comeuppance. Once again, the title of that story was, How Much Land Does a Man Need?
Chilling stuff, Jamie.
Sure is. All right, that'll do it for the examples as well as today's episode. Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you, Austin, for coming on the show.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Alrighty, folks, we will now say so long from the RAV4 studios. This has been another edition of the Word of the Day podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Silva, and we will see you next time.